The egg cracked at 23 minutes past midnight in Tio Aravel's bare hands, 2 stories above a sleeping town, and the first thing he understood before fear or wonder or any other clean word could find him was that it was warm in a way feedstock eggs were not. He had been holding it for the better part of an hour. He had come up to the loft to top up the nitrogen wash in Tank 7, the way he did every other night because Tank 7 leaked and Master Aneth would not pay to have the seal replaced. And he had found the slate-blue thing buried in a torn bag of grain, like someone had tried to hide a melon, there and then forgotten. He had pulled it out because feed bags were not meant to have melons in them. He had held it because in the cold loft it had been the only warm thing he had touched all day. Now there was a hairline crack across the copper vein, and it was widening, and a small wet ridge of something was pushing up against the inside of the shell, and Teo Aravel, 17 years old, 3 months into his apprentice contract, was sitting cross-legged on the cold tin floor of a hydroponics loft on a backwater agri-moon with both hands cupped around an egg he could not name, watching the shell open like a flower nobody had asked to grow. The thing inside made a sound. It was not a cry. It was a single small thin noise, the kind of noise water made when it found a new channel, and Tio, on the floor, in the dim green of the grow lamps, made the same noise back without thinking. The shell came away in 2 pieces in his cupped hands, slate-blue, copper-veined, surprisingly thin. Inside was a wet folded creature the length of his forearm, with a long ribbed back, 2 folded membrane wings the color of pale smoke, 4 small clawed feet, and a head that was already lifting, blind, toward the warmth of his hands. The head was draconic. The neck was draconic. The ridge of small soft horns along the skull would harden. The tail, curled tight against the small flank, was scaled. Tio had seen pictures of dragons in old books his master kept in a locked cabinet. The law on Helvendrift said you did not keep such pictures where the Reavers could see. He had never thought he would see one wet and unfolding in his own hands. It pressed its small wet head into the center of his palm, found the warmth there, and made the water sound again. "Oh," Tio said very quietly, because there was nothing else to say. "Oh!" Outside, far away, a tower bell counted the half-hour. Inside, in the green glow of the grow lamps and the slow drip of Tank 7's bad seal, the small wet thing in Teo Aravel's hands found his thumb, latched onto it with a mouth that had no teeth yet, and began, with patient blind concentration, to nurse. Tio did not move. He sat on the cold tin floor and watched the small smoke-winged creature try to drink from his thumb, and he understood, with the simple clarity of a boy who had spent 3 months sleeping in a feed loft because his contract paid in, board not wages, that whatever this was, he was not going to put it down. He looked at the broken shell halves on the floor. He looked at the torn feed bag. The brand on the bag had been blacked out with a marker, but a piece of the manifest tag was still readable on the inside seam, and the route code, when Tio squinted at it, was not a Helven drift route. It was a long-haul code, off-moon. Someone had put the egg in a feed bag they had bought at the Krelva's market and shipped it through 3 transfers to a backwater agri-moon, and someone here had been meant to find it, and that someone was not a 17-year-old hydroponics apprentice whose job was to top up Tank 7. The Imperial enforcement officers who tracked draconic contraband across the Veil systems would come for this. They came for things like this. He had heard the stories. They came clean and quiet, and they did not ask questions, and the egg, if they found the egg, would go into a sealed crate, and the 17-year-old who had been holding it would go into a different sealed crate, and the smaller crate would not be opened again. Teo Aravel, in the green dim of the loft, lifted the small wet creature out of his cupped hands, slid it gently inside the front of his tunic against the warm skin of his ribs, felt the small wet head push up into the hollow of his collarbone like it had always belonged there, and stood up. He picked up the 2 halves of the shell. He picked up the torn feed bag. He walked to Tank 7, opened the wash drain, and dropped the shell and the bag down it. Tank 7's wash drained into the underfloor mineral tank where Master Aneth processed his grow medium. By morning, the slate-blue shell and the manifest black bag would be ground into the mineral mix and pumped back up through the hydroponic feeds. He stood for a moment with his hand pressed against the small, warm shape under his tunic. Inside his tunic, the small, wet head moved. The small, wet head pressed into his collarbone again. Something, small and steady and impossibly delicate, pulsed against his ribs, and Teo Aravel realized he was holding a heartbeat that was not his own. He went down the loft ladder carefully, 1 rung at a time, the way a boy who had grown up in farm towers went down ladders when he was carrying something fragile. He walked across the dark courtyard to the small stone outbuilding where his master slept, because there was no one else on this moon he trusted enough to wake. He knocked. He waited. He knocked again, louder. He heard the slow shuffle of an old man getting out of an old cot. "Master?" The door opened a crack. Wyrms, 64, weathered as boot leather, his thin gray hair flattened on one side from the pillow, stood in the gap with a handlight angled down at the floor. "Boy, what? Something happened in the loft. Pipe burst? No. Pump burned? No. Then what?" Tio opened the front of his tunic. The handlight came up. Wyrms, 64 years old, third-generation hydroponics farmer on a backwater agri-moon at the rough edge of the Vale, stood with the handlight angled at the warm hollow of his 17-year-old apprentice's collarbone, where a small smoke-winged creature with a wet draconic head was pressing its blind face into the boy's neck. He stood for a count of 3, said nothing for a count of 3 more, then closed his eyes. The way an old man closed his eyes when something he had spent 40 years hoping he would never see had walked across his doorstep at midnight. "Boy," he said, eyes still closed. "Boy, Master I, where did you find it?" "Feed bag, tank 7, buried in the grain. The manifest tag was blacked, but the root was off moon. I dropped the shell and the bag in the wash drain. It'll go through the underfloor mix by morning." Oneth opened his eyes. He looked at Tio's face. He looked at the small wet head pressing into the boy's collarbone. He looked back at the boy's face. His own face went through 3 expressions in the span of 2 breaths. Fear first, then a flicker of something Tio could not read, then a long, slow weariness, and then he stepped back from the door and said, "Inside now, quiet." Tio went inside. Oneth closed the door. The small stone outbuilding was one room, a cot, a stove, a table, a shelf of seed catalogs, a locked cabinet of old books, a small window painted black on the inside. Oneth went to the window first, checked it, went to the door, checked the latch, went to the stove and put a kettle on, and only then did he turn to Tio and say, quietly, the words very plain, "Show me." Tio eased the small creature out of his tunic. He laid it on the table on a folded clean dish towel. It did not like leaving the warmth. It made the water sound again, louder this time, and tried to crawl back toward him on its small soft claws. Tio put his hand back on its small wet ribs to steady it, and it pressed its head into the heel of his palm and quieted. Oneth bent over it. He did not touch it. He looked at it for a long time. "That," he said finally, "is a spine-line hatchling." "A what?" "Iron spine. The high spine worms. The slate shell with copper veining, that's their clutch. I have not seen one in 51 years, and I was not supposed to see this one either. Boy, look at me." Tio looked at him. "Whoever moved this egg," Oneth said, "did not move it for a buyer on this moon. Helvendrift is a backwater. No one here could afford a spine-line hatchling. No one here would dare. This was a layover. Someone was going to collect it from the feed warehouse, 3 buildings over at First Light, and move it to the next transfer. Whoever loaded the transfer mistagged it. The bag came to my loft by mistake." The kettle whistled. Oneth lifted it off. "So someone is coming. At First Light, they will find nothing. They will leave. And then a different person will come, the one who paid them. And that person will have Reaver insurance, because they always do, and the Reavers will sweep the town." "How long?" 4 days, maybe 5. The small creature on the table chirped. It had managed to get its head off the towel and was patiently nosing toward Tio's hand on the edge of the table. Tio slid his hand under its small wet body, lifted it, tucked it back inside the warm front of his tunic against his collarbone, and the chirp turned into a low, wet, pleased hum. Oneth watched this. His mouth did something very small at one corner. "Boy." "Yes, master." "It is bonded to you." "It is what?" "Spine-line hatchling's imprint on the first warm thing they touch out of the shell. You were the warm thing. There is no undoing it. There is no taking it from you and giving it to someone else and having it survive. If I tried to take it out of that tunic now, it would scream until its lungs tore. Do you understand me?" "Ah, yes. No, listen. There is no undoing it. Which means there are 2 outcomes, boy. 1, the Reavers find it on you in the next 4 days. They take it. They take you. The hatchling, in the sealed crate, 3 hours later, stops breathing because the only warm thing it knows is in a different sealed crate. You will not be alive long enough to mourn it. 2, I get you both off Helvendrift before dawn. Off the moon, off the moon. To where?" Oneth looked at his apprentice, looked at the small wet head in the boy's collarbone, and looked for a long breath at something very far away, the way a man looked at a debt he had been carrying for 51 years. "To the spine, the iron spine, the high cliffs at the south pole of Anwen-Kor, where this hatchling's clutch mother is, where I should have taken something I once carried and did not because I was 22 and afraid. Boy, do you trust me? Yes, master. Sit down, drink the tea. Then we are going to pack a bag, and we are going to walk down to the south dock, and we are going to put you and that hatchling on the last courier skiff out of Helvan Drift before the Reaver Patrol arrives, and you are going to take a small old man with you who is going to teach you how not to die of being a boy who was warm at the wrong moment. Tio sat. The kettle was poured. The tea was hot. The small wet head inside his tunic pushed up against his collarbone and made a small, steady hum like a kettle that had never quite finished whistling. And Teo Aravel, 3 months into a hydroponics contract that was about to end, drank his master's tea and felt the small, steady pulse of a creature he had not asked for steady itself against his ribs. He looked up. Master. Yes. Does it have a name? Smiling clutches don't name. The clutch mother names them when she sees them again. Until then, it is a hatchling. Can I call it something? Until then. Aneth's mouth did the small thing at one corner. Boy, it bonded to you. You can call it whatever you want. Tio looked down at the small, warm shape under his tunic. He thought about his mother, dead 9 years, who had named him after a small, steady star. He thought about the kettle hum it was making now against his collarbone. Stell, he said, little star. Inside his tunic, the small creature, hearing the word, pressed its wet head harder into the hollow of his throat and made the hum louder. Stell, Aneth said. He said it like a man tasting a word he had not been allowed to taste in 51 years. All right, Stell, we have 4 hours before dawn, boy. Pack. They packed by handlight in the small stone outbuilding while the kettle cooled on the stove. Tio took a clean spare tunic, 2 pairs of socks, the small folding knife that had been his father's, the lukewarm half-cup of tea, and Stell, already asleep again against his collarbone, already humming softly in time with the slow, steady pulse of the boy's heart. Aneth took less. A small leather satchel of old papers he kept locked in a drawer Tio had never been allowed to look in, a worn long coat, a small heavy revolver Tio had not known he owned, a single thin metal disc on a worn cord, which the old man pulled out of the bottom of the satchel and looked at for a long second before he put the cord over his head. What is that, master? A keeper's token. Aye, what? Later, boy, walk. They walked. The town of Salisol Helvan was asleep, the dark courtyard, the dark grain warehouses 3 buildings over, the dark cobble road down to the south dock. They walked fast and quiet, and Aneth, 64, bad hips, kept up by sheer stubbornness, and Tio did not look back. The south dock was a small dock. A courier skiff was lit on berth 1, prepping for a pre-dawn departure. The skiff captain, a tall, thin woman with 3 braids, the kind of dock runner who did not ask questions and charged extra for the privilege, was at the gangway with a clipboard. Aneth walked up, dropped a coin pouch on her clipboard, and said 2. The captain looked at the pouch. She looked at Tio. She looked at the bulge under Tio's tunic. She did not change her expression. 2, she said. Cargo declared as what? Nothing. Nothing is 15. It's 15 in the pouch and 1 more for not asking. She picked up the pouch, did not count it, dropped it into the inside pocket of her coat, and said, berth 6 and 7. Aft we lift in 11 minutes. Get in. They got in. Aneth went first, slow on the gangway with his bad hips. Tio went after, one hand pressed against his tunic the whole way, feeling the small warm hum against his ribs. The skiff was small and old, and smelled of coolant. Berths 6 and 7 were narrow padded shelves behind a curtain. They lay down. The skiff lifted off Salon Helvan at 3 minutes before 5, and climbed through the thin upper atmosphere toward the transfer station overhead. Tio, on his shelf behind the curtain with Stell curled inside his tunic, watched the green of Helvan Drift fall away through the port above his head. Inside his tunic, Stell hummed. Tio closed his eyes. Boy, Aneth said quietly from the other berth on the other side of the curtain. You should sleep. I can't, master. Try, master. Yes. What are we going to do at the spine? There was a long silence. The skiff drone changed pitch as the maneuvering thrusters fired. We are going to walk you up to the high cliffs, Aneth said, and we are going to set Stell down on a flat rock, and we are going to step back, and we are going to wait. The Wyrms will come. The clutch mother will come. She will see her hatchling. She will see what carried it home. And then, he paused. And then we are going to find out whether the high spine remembers what a kindness looks like, or whether I have spent 51 years of my life believing in something that no longer exists. And if they remember, then you walk down off the cliff with a clutch mother's blessing and a long life ahead of you, boy. And if they don't, Aneth did not answer for a while. The skiff drone climbed and steadied. The transfer station's approach beacon was already winking, faint, through the small port over Tio's head. If they don't, Aneth said, then I will have been wrong about a thing I have carried for a long time, and I will be sorry, and we will deal with what comes. Teo Aravel, 17, on a courier skiff lifting off a backwater moon at 5 in the morning, with a small smoke-winged creature humming against his collarbone, closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Stell shifted against his ribs. Stell pushed her wet head harder up under his chin. Stell made the small water sound from inside his tunic faintly, like she was answering a question only she had heard. Teo opened his eyes. The port above his head had filled with stars. He was looking at the same sky his mother had once tried to name for him on the roof of their old house. A sky he had stopped looking at because she was no longer there to name it, and the small warm thing against his ribs was the first warm thing he had been allowed to keep in 9 years. He put his hand over Stell gently through the tunic. "All right, little star," he whispered. "We're going." The skiff climbed. Behind him on the other berth, Aneth Vyre, keeper's token under his shirt, 51 years late on a debt, closed his own eyes and did not sleep either. The transfer station above Helven Drift was small, dirty, and indifferent to its passengers. Aneth bought passage on a second skiff, a freight hopper bound for Anwin Core with a hold full of grain, machinery. By walking up to a tired clerk and laying 2 thin metal certificates on her counter that Teo did not recognize. The clerk looked at the certificates, looked at Aneth, looked at the certificates again, and did not ask Aneth's name. 2 berths, freight class. Departure in 40 minutes. 3 days transit. 3 days. The clerk slid the certificates back. Don't talk to the crew. They did not talk to the crew. They lay on 2 narrow shelves in the back of a hopper that smelled like grain dust and old grease. And for 3 days Teo watched the small smoke-winged thing in his tunic eat, sleep, hum, and grow. By day 3 she had small hard nubs along her spine. Her wings had unfolded enough that she could not be hidden under a tunic anymore, and her eyes had opened, copper, the color of the vein that had run through her shell. Teo fed her by hand. He cut a piece of grain paste off his own ration, warmed it in his fist, and offered it on the tip of his finger. He cut another. She took that. He cut a third, and she pushed her wet snout into his palm and would not eat the third until he had eaten one himself, and Teo, who had no creature in the universe who cared what he ate, took a piece of grain paste and chewed it. Stell hummed. Aneth, watching from the other shelf, said nothing at all. On the second day, Teo, with Stell coiled warm on his stomach and her copper eyes half closed, looked over at his master and said, "You said you carried something." Aneth was looking at the ceiling. He did not turn his head. "I said that." "Carried what?" A long quiet. The hopper drone changed pitch as the engines trimmed. "Carried an egg," Aneth said. "When I was 22. A different egg. Different clutch. A small green one, mottled. A Stillwater line egg from the South Wetland clans. It was not a spine clutch. It was a smaller line. But it cracked in my hands the same way." Teo did not interrupt. "My grandfather had been a keeper. Not a high keeper. A south door keeper. The kind who walked the marsh boundary and called the brood mothers in for the long rains. He died when I was 7. He left a keeper's token, the one I am wearing now, and a journal and a name, and I read the journal when I was 22. And I went looking for a clutch he had once tended, and I found a poacher's cold bag in a market on a frontier moon, and inside it there was a small green mottled egg, half frozen but alive. What did you do?" "I bought it for everything in my pockets. I took it home. I tried to warm it. It cracked open at my kitchen table at 3 in the morning. And I was 22 and afraid. There was no Stell on the other side of that shell. There was a small green Stillwater hatchling, and she imprinted on me the same way Stell imprinted on you. And for 3 days, I did exactly what you have been doing. I fed her. I kept her warm. I named her Tess. I named her Tess because, and then on the 4th day there was a Reaver knock at my door, and he stopped. You ran. I gave her to them." The hopper drone changed pitch again. Stell, on Teo's stomach, stirred and pushed her wet head harder against the warm skin under his ribs. "You gave her to them. They told me they would take her back to the clan mother. I was 22. I had a farm and a sick father. I wanted to believe them. He put her in a sealed crate and carried her out of my house, and I never saw her again. 6 months later, a Stillwater broodmother walked herself into a poacher's killing field on a moon called Vel, because her clutch mark had not come back in season. She made them shoot her so the trap would close and the other broodmothers would know what the trap was. I read about it on a Thursday afternoon. I have been a man who did not run for 51 years. The hopper drone hummed. "Master, yes. This time you are running, yes, with me. With you, boy. Why?" A long silence, then Aneth, very quietly because Stell hums when you eat. Teo, on his shelf, did not know what to do with that. He put his hand down on Stell's small warm flank and felt the small steady hum, and he thought about a green Stillwater hatchling named Tess in a sealed crate 51 years ago, and he thought about a small dark brood mother on a moon called Vel walking into a killing field with her wings open, and he thought about his master, who had let him hold the slate-blue shell and had asked him only one question. "Do you trust me?" "I am sorry," Teo said. "For what?" For her. There was a long silence on the other shelf. Then Aneth very quietly, with something in his voice that Teo had never heard there in 3 months of apprentice service. "Thank you, boy." The hopper drone hummed. Stell shifted on Teo's stomach in her sleep, and the small water sound came up out of her once, soft like a thing dreaming. They came out of jump at Anwin Core on the morning of the 4th day. Anwin Core was a cold blue planet, 3/4 water, with a single great continent at its south pole. A continent of broken stone cliffs, glacial valleys, slow black rivers, and the bone-white spine of mountains that ran along its southern edge and had given the high Wyrms their name. The hopper dropped them at a rough port called Stren on the north edge of the cliffs. They walked off the freight ramp into a wind that smelled like iron and salt and ice. Aneth tightened the long coat. 2 days walking from here, boy, maybe 3 if my hips hold. The spine doesn't have a road. We will take the old keeper's track. Stell was inside Teo's tunic again, mostly. Her head and one wingtip stuck out at the collar. Her copper eyes were wide. She had never seen sky this big. They started walking. The keeper's track was old, narrow, half buried in scree, and it ran south along the broken shelves at the foot of the high cliffs. Aneth walked slowly. Teo walked beside him. Stell, after the first hour, made it clear by humming louder and pushing her snout up into the cold air that she wanted to come out. And Teo, after the second hour, gave up on hiding her and unbuttoned his tunic and let her ride sitting on his shoulder with her tail wrapped around his neck and her wings half open against the wind. Her copper eyes drank the cliffs. The cliffs went up forever. The cliffs were the color of old iron. There were dark openings in them, high up where the wind made a low sustained note. There were no birds. There were no other tracks. There was only the slow creak of Aneth's bad hip and the steady scrape of 2 pairs of boots on scree, and the small thin humming of Stell on Teo's shoulder, and the wind. They camped the first night under an overhang. Aneth cut a piece of dried meat, warmed it, and held it out to Stell. She took it from his fingers, ate it neatly, and pushed her wet snout once against the back of his hand. Aneth looked at his hand a long time. Teo, on the other side of the fire, said nothing. He thought, watching his master's face in the firelight, that some debts took a long time to come due. The second day the keeper's track climbed. Aneth's hip was worse. He did not complain. They stopped twice, once to drink, once for Aneth to sit on a flat stone for 15 minutes with his teeth set, and on the second stop, while the old man's color came back, Teo, walking a small careful circle to keep his own legs warm, saw the first sign of what was following them. Boot prints. On the keeper's track, 2 days fresh, not Teo's, not Aneth's. A larger boot with a regulation tread. He went very still. Aneth, on the rock, opened his eyes. "Boy, master, what? There are tracks." Aneth got up off the rock. He came over. He bent, with one hand on his hip, and looked at the prints. He looked at them for a long, careful breath. Then he straightened, with something flickering at the back of his eyes that Teo had not seen there before. "Reaver, how?" "They have a checkpoint at Stren. We walked off the ramp under our own names. Someone there flagged us. Old man boy off route, not declared cargo. They sent a courier runner up the track to track us. We have maybe a day and a half before he catches us. Just one. Just one. The Reaver Corps does not send teams onto the spine. They send one Reaver. A single Reaver. Because the Reavers are the only ones in the Empire that the spine worms, historically, have not eaten on sight. They use that. They go alone." Teo looked at the cliffs. The cliffs went up forever. "Master, how far to the high roost? A day and a half if my hip holds. A day if it doesn't, and I walk through it. Then we walk through it." Aneth looked at his apprentice. Aneth looked for a long second, like he was about to argue with him. He didn't. "All right, boy, we walk through it." They walked through it. Aneth's hip seized at noon, and he sat on a stone for 10 minutes, and Teo did not say anything. Aneth's hip eased, and he stood up, and they walked some more. Stell, on Teo's shoulder, had stopped humming around mid-morning. She had grown a third again since they left Stren. She was the size of a barn cat now, with wings half her body length, and her copper eyes were watching the cliffs in a way that Teo did not know how to read. In the late afternoon, on a stretch of track where the scree fell off to the south, and the cliffs rose to the north. She lifted her head, ribbed her long neck back, opened her small jaws, and made a sound that was not the water sound, was not the kettle hum, was not anything Tio had heard her make in 4 days. It was a thin, clean call, a single rising note. It rang. The cliffs took it. The cliffs held it. The cliffs, somewhere very high up, gave it back. A different note, lower, longer, that traveled through the iron stone and into Tio's bones. And Stell, on his shoulder, sat up tall and made the rising note again. And the high cliffs answered her again, and Aneth, 10 paces ahead on the track, stopped walking. Boy, master, she called them. I know, they answered. I know. They stood on the keeper's track, the wind in their hair, the cliffs going up forever, and they listened to a small smoke-winged creature on the shoulder of a 17-year-old hydroponics apprentice call to the high spine, and to the high spine call back, and the second call was the deeper one. Aneth, for one fraction of a second, smiled. Walk, boy, faster. He is behind us. They walked faster. He caught them 3 hours later, an hour from the high roost, on a long, thin shelf of stone where the track narrowed against the cliff, and the scree fell 200 feet to a frozen stream. The Reaver was a tall man with cropped pale hair, a long gray coat, a service rifle slung across his back, and a clean black sidearm at his hip. He was alone. He was not winded. He had the look of a man who had walked the keeper's track before. He stepped out from behind a stone shoulder 10 paces ahead of them and raised one gloved hand, palm out, and said in a flat, polite voice, Master Wyrm, Apprentice Aravel, stop walking. Aneth stopped walking. Tio stopped walking. Stell, on Tio's shoulder, lowered her head between her shoulder blades and made a thin sound that was not a hum. My name is Soon, the Reaver said. I am with the Imperial Enforcement Corps. I am here for the slate-blue hatchling currently riding on the boy's shoulder. I would like to take her without harming either of you. I would like to walk back down to Stren and put her in a clean-sealed transport and bring her to the breeding facility at Krelvis. I would like to do this in the next half hour. Please make this easy. Aneth did not move. Aneth's hand had gone very slowly, very steady to the inside of his long coat. Soon saw it. Master Wyrm, do not. Yes. You know what she is. I do. Then you know I cannot let you take her. Master Wyrm, you are 64. You have a bad hip. You have a service revolver in your coat that is probably 40 years old and has not been fired in 20. I have a service rifle, a sidearm, and I trained for this. Please do not. Reaver, Master Wyrm, step off the track. Let us pass. Let her go home. Soon sighed. He did not move. His face did not change. Tio realized, watching him, that the man was not unkind exactly. He was tired. He was a man who had done this many times. He was a man who, in some quiet hour of his life, had decided that the rules were the rules, and the hatchlings went into sealed crates, and the people who carried them did not, and he had built a 40-year career out of that decision, and he had walked up onto the keeper's track this afternoon with a service rifle and a fleeced sidearm and the patient, unkind certainty of a man who had done this many times before. Master Wyrm, Soon said, I will count to 3. Aneth Wyrm drew the revolver. He did not raise it. He held it down by his thigh, the barrel pointed at the scree. Reaver, step off the track. 1. Stell, on Tio's shoulder, made the thin sound again, louder this time, and her wings half opened, and Tio reached up to steady her. 2. Tio Aravel looked at his master, looked at the Reaver, looked at the small smoke-winged creature on his own shoulder, and stepped calmly between them. Boy, no, Reaver, Soon, Tio said. His voice was thin. My name is Tio Aravel. I am 17. The egg came to my loft by mistake. I held it because it was cold. It hatched in my hands. Her name is Stell. If you put her in a sealed crate, she will scream until her lungs tear, and she will be dead in 3 hours, and you know that. I am asking you, please, to let us walk past. Let the clutch mother see her. Let her go home. Soon did not move. His eyes, for one fraction of a second, flickered. 3, said. He drew his sidearm. Aneth raised his revolver. Small, smoke-winged, 4 days old, opened her jaws and made the rising call, the third time the loudest, and the high spine, somewhere above them on the cliffs, somewhere very close, answered her, not with a returning note, but with the sound of stone shifting under the weight of something very large coming down. Stone shifted above them, not the small, slow crackle of scree settling, the deep, settled groan of something the size of a freight hopper moving its weight off a ledge it had been sitting on for a long time. Soon's sidearm did not waver, but his eyes for the second time flickered up. The next sound was wings, not the small fluttering of Stell's smoke-pale wings against Tio's tunic. Wings the size of cargo sails, slow, deliberate, beating once and then gliding, beating once and then gliding. The kind of wings that did not need to flap because the air came up off the cliffs warm, and the wings only had to ride it. 3 shapes came down off the spine. They did not land between Teo and the Reaver. They landed on the cliff wall above the track, 3 points along the long iron stone, and they did not roar, and they did not posture, and they did not threat display. They simply set their great clawed feet against the cliff and folded their wings against their flanks and looked down. The leftmost was deep red, long-necked, with old white scars across her muzzle. The rightmost was slate blue with copper veining along his ribs, a male much larger than Stell would ever be, but unmistakably Stell's clutchline. And in the center on a higher ledge settled the third. She was bronze. She was the size of a small ship. Her scales were the color of cured bronze gone slightly green at the edges, with copper running deep through the heavy plates of her chest, the way the same copper had run through Stell's shell. Her eyes were 2 slow molten suns. She did not move. She did not breathe in any way that Teo could see. She simply settled her bulk against the cliff face above the track, folded her great wings, lowered her enormous bronze head, and looked at the small smoke-winged thing on the 17-year-old apprentice's shoulder. Stell made the rising call once more, a small, thin, true voice on a wind that smelled like iron and ice. The bronze matriarch, Akaleth of the Spine, who had not come down to a keeper's track in 19 years, opened her great jaws very slightly, and answered her hatchling with a sound that was the deeper note Teo had heard through the ironstone stone. Only now it was not echoing through stone. It was being made an arm's length above his head, and it rang through his ribcage like a bell that had been waiting for someone to touch it. Keithel Sune did not lower his sidearm, but he did not raise it either. He had gone in the way of a trained man, completely still. "Master Vyre," he said. His voice was the same flat, polite voice as before, but tighter. "Tell the boy to set the hatchling down." "No," Aneth said, quiet. "I will not. Master Veer, this is Reaver. Look at her. I am looking at her." "No, Reaver, look at her. That is Akaleth, the spine matriarch, the one your service has photographs of from 19 years ago. The one your service has been advised, in 3 separate dispatches I have read with my own eyes, never to engage. She has come down to this track in daylight in front of 3 witnesses because the boy carried her hatchling 6 days across 2 systems on his collarbone. You are about to make her angry, Reaver. I am 64. I will not survive it. The boy will not survive it. You will not survive it. I am asking you, step off the track." Keithel Sune did not move. Akaleth shifted on her ledge. The shift moved enough stone that 2 small boulders went off the edge and bounced once on the scree and disappeared down toward the frozen stream. Teo, between his master and the Reaver, with a small smoke-winged creature breathing fast on his shoulder, did something he would not be able to explain to himself later. He turned toward the cliff wall, toward the bronze matriarch, and he lifted Stell off his shoulder with both hands, gently, carefully, the way he had lifted her out of her broken shell 6 days ago, and he held her out at chest height on his upturned palms into the open air between himself and the high ledge. He did not say anything. He had nothing to say. Stell, on his palms, looked up at the great bronze head above her. Stell, 4 days into the only life she had ever known, made a small, thin, true voice that was neither the rising call, nor the kettle hum, nor the water sound. It was simply a small noise of being held in a pair of hands she trusted, asking a question. Akaleth lowered her enormous head. She did not come down off the ledge. She did not have to. Her neck was long enough that her great bronze muzzle, slow as a barge docking, came down across the open air of the track until it was an arm's length from Teo's outstretched hands. Her 2 molten suns, each one the size of his head, were so close he could feel the warmth coming off them. She looked at Stell. She looked then at the boy holding Stell. She looked at him for a long count of seconds. Teo did not breathe. He could feel his master 3 paces behind him, also not breathing. He could feel the Reaver 10 paces ahead. The bronze matriarch made one small, precise sound. It was, very clearly, a name. It was 3 soft tones, low, low, rising, and it was not Stell, and it was not any human word, but it was a name, and Stell on Teo's open palms heard it and shivered her smoke-pale wings once, and made the same 3 tones back quietly, like a small child saying her own name to a parent who had been gone a long time. The matriarch's molten eyes turned, very slowly, toward Teo. She blew very gently across his face. The breath was warm. It smelled like cedar and iron and something old that he did not have a word for. She lowered her huge bronze brow until it touched very lightly the tip of his thumb on his outstretched left hand. She touched him. That was the whole thing. For one count of 3, the bronze matriarch of the spine touched the thumb of a 17-year-old hydroponics apprentice who had warmed her hatchling in a feed loft on a backwater moon, and then she lifted her head, slow, deliberate, back up to her ledge, and she did not look at the Reaver at all. She did not have to. The deep-red female and the slate-blue male on the lower ledges. Stell's elder kin, her clutch uncles, the two who had come down with the matriarch, both turned their great heads now toward Kethel-Suni. They did not snarl. They did not posture. They simply opened their wings, very slightly, very deliberately, as a man might roll his sleeves. Kethel-Suni lowered his sidearm. He lowered it slowly. He turned it carefully sideways so the muzzle pointed at the screen. He set it very gently on a flat stone beside his boot. He took 2 steps back from the stone. He raised both gloved hands, palms out at shoulder height. "Master Wyrm," he said. His voice was no longer flat. "Master Wyrm, I will step off the track. Reaver, yes. You will walk back to Stren. You will tell your superiors that you found 2 unauthorized travelers on the Keeper's track, and that you were unable to detain them because they had been received into the High Roost. You will use those words. They are a regulation phrase in your service's old code. They mean a Reaver did not get killed. Your superiors will understand. Yes, Master Wyrm, you will not come up the Keeper's track again. No, Master Veer. You will tell no one what you saw here. Not because we will punish you if you do, we will not, but because if you do, your service will lose a Reaver of 40 years' experience to a desk in Krelva's, and you will not enjoy that desk. I am offering you, Reaver, soon, one chance to walk back down the way you came up and to be allowed to remember this without dying of it. Will you take it?" A long, careful breath. "Yes," Kethel-Suni said. "I will take it. Walk." Kethel-Suni walked. He walked slowly, deliberately, without turning his back fully on the cliff. He left his sidearm on the flat stone. He walked past Aneth, past Teo, past the cliff wall where 3 great folded shapes watched, and he did not stop walking until he was a small gray figure on the Scree-2 ridge's back, and then the wind took the sound of his boots, and he was gone. Teo stood with Stell on his open palms and felt his knees very slowly start to give. Aneth came up behind him and put a hand on his shoulder, and his master's hand was the only thing that kept the knees from going. "Easy, boy." "Master." "Easy," Teo breathed. Above them on the cliff, a Caliph had not moved. The deep red female and the slate-blue male had not moved. They were waiting. "Boy," Aneth said quietly, "she is asking for her." "I know. Set her on the flat stone there. The one the Reaver set the sidearm on. That's a Keeper's stone. It is meant for handover. Set her down. Step back." Teo looked down at the small smoke-wing thing on his open palms. Stell looked up at him. Her copper eyes, already, somehow, larger than they had been 6 days ago, were calm. She did not push her head into his palm. She did not make the kettle hum. She made instead the 3 soft tones, low, low, rising, that the matriarch had spoken, and she made them at Teo, and Teo understood, in the way a boy understood the only thing he had ever been told plain, that he was being told her name. He could not say it back. His mouth could not make the second low tone. He tried anyway. He made a poor approximation. Stell pushed her snout against his thumb and made a small pleased water sound, and Teo, with his mouth shaking, laughed once, a small rough laugh, and walked the 4 steps to the flat stone and knelt and set her down on it gently and stepped back. Stell sat on the Keeper's stone, with her smoke-pale wings half spread, looking up. The slate-blue male, her clutch uncle, came down first. He lowered his great head until his muzzle was at the level of Stell's small shoulders, and made the 3 soft tones. Stell answered. He pushed his great muzzle carefully against her small flank, and she leaned into it and made the kettle hum. The deep red female came down second. She looked at Stell. She looked then at Teo and Aneth, and bowed her long red neck, once deliberately to Teo, and Teo, who had no idea what to do with a deep red dragon bowing to him, bowed back the way his mother had taught him to bow to old people, hands at his sides, head lowered. When he looked up, the deep red female's old white-scarred muzzle had something at the corner of it he could only have called a smile. Akalith came down last. She did not land on the shelf. The shelf was not big enough. She set her 2 great forefeet on the scree beyond the shelf, and let the rest of her bulk hang against the cliff face. And she lowered her huge bronze head onto the shelf, and her muzzle was longer than Teo was tall, and she lowered it slowly until her great bronze brow was at the level of the boy's chest. She looked at him. "Boy," Aneth said quietly behind him. "She will speak. The token at my throat is for translation. Hold still." Aneth lifted the Keeper's token from his shirt. He held it up in his closed fist in front of his own throat. The thin metal disc warmed once faintly the way a small lamp came on. Akalith spoke. Her voice was, Up close, not loud. It was the sound an old wooden bell would make if the bell had been struck once 100 years ago and had been holding the note ever since. The keeper's token in Aneth's fist warmed, and the warmth carried the meaning, and Teo heard the words inside his own head, the way a person heard a memory of being told something. Boy. Yes, Teo said. His voice was very small. Yes, ma'am, you held her. Yes, you warmed her. Yes, you fed her from your own ration. You named her for the small, steady star your mother taught you. You walked her 6 days across 2 systems on your own shoulder. You set yourself between her and the man with the gun. Yes. The matriarch breathed out very slowly. The breath again smelled of cedar and iron. The keeper's token in Aneth's fist hummed. Boy, what is your name? Teo Aravel, Teo Aravel. The spine has not taken a kindness like yours into its account in 19 years. The spine remembers. We remember her name was Tess. Aneth, behind Teo, made a very small sound. Akaleth's molten eyes shifted very slightly past Teo's shoulder toward the old man. Keeper Vyre, the south wetland is closed to your line. The boy you were was afraid. We have not forgiven you. But we have today watched you draw an old gun on a reaver at the side of a boy who carried a spine hatchling on his collarbone. You have finished a thing you began 51 years ago. The spine is not the south wetland, but the spine is open to you. Tess's broodmother will be told today. She will be told it was not your fault. She will know your name on the wetland again. That is all I can give you. Aneth, behind Teo, did not answer for a long count of breaths. When he spoke, his voice was steady. Matriarch, that is more than I came for. Thank you. Keeper, yes, you are welcome. Akaleth's molten eyes came back to Teo. Boy, Teo Aravel. Stell will grow. In a season, she will be the size of a barn. In 2 seasons, she will be the size of a freight hopper. She will fly and hunt and roost with her clutchkin. But she is bonded to you. When she calls, you will hear her. When you call, and you will learn how, she will come. The spine is open to you, Teo Aravel. Come to the high roost when you are tired. The spine will have a stone warm for you both always. Teo could not speak. He nodded. He nodded twice. He bowed the way his mother had taught him. Akaleth's enormous bronze head leaned the last small distance and touched his forehead very gently with the warm scaled ridge between her 2 molten eyes. The touch was no heavier than a hand laid on a sleeping child's hair. It lasted 1 breath. She lifted her head. She unfolded her wings, slow, deliberate, as wide as the shelf was long, and she pushed off the scree with her 2 great 4 feet and lifted, and the wind from her wings flattened Teo's tunic against his chest and pushed Aneth's coattails out behind him and lifted 3 small stones off the keeper's track and dropped them very gently back where they had been. She rose up the cliff face. The deep red female and the slate-blue male took the air with her. Stell, small smoke-winged Stell, sat on the keeper's stone watching them rise, then turned her copper eyes back to Teo. She opened her own small wings, awkward, untrained, 4 days old, beat them badly twice, and rose barely to the level of Teo's chin, hovering, wobbling. Teo, laughing in a way he had not laughed since he was 8, raised his arms. Stell flew into them. For 1 count of breaths in the wind off the cliffs, with 3 great shapes climbing the iron stone above them, Teo Aravel stood at the foot of the spine and held a small smoke-winged creature who had chosen him, and was choosing him, and would choose him for the rest of his life. And his master, behind him, put a 64-year-old hand gently on the boy's shoulder. They stood there a long time. Eventually, the matriarch and her kin disappeared into one of the high openings. Eventually, Stell pushed her smoke-pale head against the underside of Teo's chin and made the small kettle hum, and Teo, smiling, really smiling, for the first time in 9 years, set her on his shoulder, and her tail wrapped around his neck, and they began to walk back down the keeper's track. Aneth walked beside him. Aneth's bad hip was no better, but his face was. His face had something settled in it that Teo had never seen before. The Reaver's sidearm was still on the flat stone. They left it there. Halfway back down to the camp under the overhang, Aneth said quietly, "Boy." "Yes, Master, you did a thing." "Master, I know what you only. I know, that is exactly what you did. You only. Boy, that is the whole thing. The spine has a word for it. The keeper's token translated it for me on the shelf. The word is, it does not come out clean in trade standard. It is something like the kindness that did not look for an audience. That is what they came down for. That is what she touched your forehead for, boy. Do you understand?" I think so, Master." "Good. Walk." They walked. They reached the camp under the overhang at sunset. Aneth made a small fire and cut dried meat, for himself, for Teo, for Stell. The wind on the cliffs eased. The stars came out, and Teo found, low on the southern horizon, the small steady star his mother had once named for him, and pointed it out to Stell, and Stell looked at the star, and looked at the boy, and made the kettle hum. In the morning they walked the rest of the way down to Stren. Aneth's hip was somehow better. Stell, by the time they reached the freight ramp, was already too big for a tunic. She rode openly on Teo's shoulder. The dock hands stared. Nobody asked questions. They bought passage back to Anwenkor's main port on a grain hopper. From there, a slow freighter to a small frontier moon called Hessel, where Aneth Vyre, who had quietly liquidated a hydroponics compound by long-range certificate during the 3-day jump, bought a small stone cottage on the edge of a southwind plateau, with a clear flat roof where a smoke-winged creature could roost, and a long view of the southern sky. On the first evening, Aneth sat on the porch with a cup of tea and a worn book. Stell, already the size of a young horse, sat across the warm flat roof above them with her smoke-pale wings folded, and her copper eyes half-closed, humming very softly the kettle hum. Teo brought his master a second cup of tea and sat down on the porch step beside the rocking chair. "Master, boy, what happens now?" Aneth Vyre, 64 years old, with a keeper's token warm under his shirt and the south wind on his face, drank his tea slowly. He looked at the small kitchen garden Teo had begun that afternoon. He looked at the long view of the southern sky, where in an hour the small steady star would come up just above the line of the hills. "Now, boy," he said, "we live. That is the whole answer. That is the whole answer." Teo thought about that. He thought about a slate-blue shell with a copper vein, a small thin water sound on a cold tin floor, a keeper's stone at the foot of the iron spine, a bronze brow touching his forehead. He thought about his master, closing his eyes in a doorway 6 days ago, the long, slow weariness of a man who had carried something for 51 years. Finally setting it down, he looked up. Above them on the warm, flat roof, Stell, small star, 4 days bonded, 20 seasons of growing still ahead of her, lifted her great smoke-pale head against the violet sky and made the rising call, once, toward the south. Far away, almost too faint to be sound, the deeper note answered her through the iron stone of a continent. She lowered her head. She looked down over the eve at the two of them on the porch. Teo raised his cup of tea, slowly, the way his master had taught him to raise a hand to a freighter he had fixed and watched leave the dock. Stell pushed her warm, smoke-pale muzzle very gently against the top of his head. The small, steady star came up over the hills. "All right," Teo said quietly, to nobody and to everybody, to his master in the rocking chair, to the small, warm shape above him on the roof, to a bronze matriarch on a cliff a long way south, to the mother who had once named a star for him on the roof of an old house he had stopped looking at when she was no longer there to name it. "All right, let's live." Aneth Vyre on the porch smiled the small thing at the corner of his mouth. Above them, Stell hummed. The south wind eased. They lived.